Joining us now is Michael Eric Dyson, professor of African American Studies at Vanderbilt University. And Michael, we heard Minnesota's Attorney General say tonight, this is not justice, it's accountability. One verdict doesn't heal deep wounds. So what happens next?
Well, I think he's absolutely right. And what we have to remember is these are systemic issues. It's not isolated incident here and an isolated incident there. These things have repeatedly happened across the board. And so what must we do to make certain that policing itself is rid of the systemic inequities, the unconscious biases, and the conscious bigotries that have often flooded that community with a kind of deleterious and negative impact on black people? How can black people feel safe when the police stop them, like Dante Wright, right there in Minnesota, who felt that his life would be challenged, would be vulnerable if he stopped with the police, and God knows he ended up being shot. So we have to make certain that we do police reform across the board, that we dismantle systems of inequity that lead to the perpetuation of the loss of life for black and poor people in this nation. And until we have a serious reckoning with what is going on across the board, we won't have true justice for black citizens in this country.
Let's also bring in CBS's Wesley Lowery. He joins us. He won a Pulitzer for his reporting on use of force by police. And Wes, this question now, the systemic reform is needed. What do you expect happens?
It's a big question about what's going to happen next. You know, I was watching the verdict with a longtime activist here in Los Angeles who had been involved going back 30 years to Rodney King and beforehand. And he said, you know, this verdict shows that black life matters, that Americans can see and feel the pain that black Americans have seen for so long. But he noted that one verdict is not, in fact, a systemic change. The big questions we still have before us is what, if any, changes, systemic and structural changes to policing are elected officials, both locally and nationally, willing to engage in. But beyond that, this bigger question of, you know, will black Americans be able to achieve full justice, equity, equality under law, right? It's been the push and pull, a struggle going back to this nation's original sin. Now, today is a day that looks very different than 30 years ago when, you know, 4 not guilty verdicts came down in the beating of Rodney King, a videotaped atrocity that was, to many black Americans, a depiction of a clear abuse of power. Today, we see 3 guilty verdicts. George Floyd's family receives justice, but they've still lost George Floyd, right? And so on the one hand, we see guilty verdicts, activists getting what they've called for in this case, something that looks like accountability. On the other hand, George Floyd was still killed. He was still underneath former officer Derek Chauvin's knee for more than 9 minutes. And the verdicts today don't change that.
Mm-hmm. But does it encourage the type of reform that's needed legislatively?
Well, it could cut in both directions. One thing I would note is that a lot of the reforms that have been proposed, both nationally and locally, are reforms that would not have saved George Floyd's life. That had some of these pieces of legislation been passed, George Floyd still would have been killed if the officer chose to do this. I do think this does help build momentum on Capitol Hill, but there's a secondary question of whether or not the legislation being considered will in fact speak to the problems that the folks in the street are talking about. On the other hand, there's also a chance that if activists are calling for big systemic change, people who might be opposed to that reform might say, well, look, the system works as is. Why do we need to change things? The officer was found guilty. He's being sent to prison. And so there still is a push and pull here about whether or not change will happen. And again, even if it does happen, if it will actually be the type of change that ensures there will not be additional George Floyds. And currently, we're not seeing any legislation being proposed that on the merits would prevent something like what happened last summer.
Such an important point. Wesley Lowery and Michael Eric Dyson, thank you very much for joining us.